Hello everybody and welcome back to LELB Society. I'm Dr. Hariri, the founder of LELB Society, and in this lecture I'm going to talk about one of the articles that I have recently published under the title of The Role of Imitation in Language Acquisition. I'm going to share the link to this article in the description area. Okay. So let's get started. You can skip the table of contents. Okay, what is imitation? Vygotsky, 1987, as cited in Lantolf, 2006, proposed that the internalization of socially constructed forms of mediation occurs through the mechanisms of imitation. One of the earliest scholars to propose imitation as a uniquely human form of learning and development was Baldwin, 1895 to 1915, as cited in Lantolf, 2006. For Baldwin, imitation, especially when he called persistent imitation, to the intelligent and earnest imitator is never slavish, never mere repetition. It is, on the contrary, a means for further ends, a method of absorbing what is present in others and of making it over in forms peculiar to one's own temper and valuable to one's own genius. Walsinger and Van der Veer, 2000, page 153, cited in Lantolf, 2006. Stern's concept of convergence. Stearns takes care not to disregard the part that imitation plays in speech development or the role of the child's spontaneous activity by applying to these issues his concept of convergence. The child's conquest of speech occurs through a constant interaction of inner disposition prompting the child to speech and external conditions, i.e., the speech of people around him, which provides both simulation and material for the realization of these dispositions. Kozulin, 1986. Persistent imitation entails cognitive activity. It is cyclic and reproductive. Both each reproductive cycle works not on the original but on the previous imitation. Baldwin, no date, as cited in Lantolf, 2006. The key to understanding internalization is Vygotsky's notion of imitation. Ellis, 2008. Vygotsky, 1987, as cited in Lantolf, 2006, reflecting the thinking of Baldwin and others at that time, saw imitation as a complex and transformative activity and considered it to be the source of all the specifically human characteristics of consciousness that develop in the child. Page 210. Newman and Holzman, 1993, as cited in Lantolf, 2006, stressed that imitation is not about parroting others, but is about creating something new out of saying or doing the same thing. Page 151, that other members of the culture do. Imitation versus emulation. Central to imitation is the capacity to map the goal of an activity on the means through which it is carried out. Tomasello, 1999, as cited in Lantolf, 2006. This distinguishes imitation from emulation in which the goal is recognized but the means is not. Humans are able to match the goal and the means of achieving some activity that is imitation, whereas other primates, such as chimps, are able to recognize the goal of an activity without understanding the relevance of the means, that is, emulation. Both imitation and emulation are distinguished from mimicry by virtue of the fact that in the latter, an understanding of the goal is also absent. Yerkes and learned 1925 as cited in Kozlin 1986 maintain vocal reactions are very frequent and varied in young chimpanzees, but speech in the human sense is absent. Their vocal apparatus is as well developed and functions as well as man's. What is missing is the tendency to imitate sounds. Their mimicry is almost entirely dependent on optical stimuli. They copy actions but not sounds. They are incapable of doing what the parrot does so successfully. If the imitative tendency of the parrot were combined with the caliber of intellect of the chimpanzee, the latter undoubtedly would possess speech, since he has a voice mechanism comparable to man's as well as an intellect of the type and level to enable him to use sounds for purposes of real speech. Page 53. First language acquisition. According to Lightbound and Spada 2006, over the past 50 years, three main theoretical positions have been advanced to explain language development from infancy through the early school years. These three positions are Orism, I don't know how to pronounce them because interactionism and also behaviorism, these are so difficult to pronounce. Behaviorism, say what I say. Behaviorism was a theory of learning that was very influential in the 1940s and 50s, especially in the United States. With regard to language learning, the best known proponent of this psychological theory was B.F. Skinner. Traditional behaviorists hypothesized that when children imitated the language produced by those around them, their attempts to reproduce what they heard received positive reinforcement. This could take the form of praise or just successful communication. Lightbound and Spada 2006. Encouraged by their environment, children would continue to imitate and practice these sounds and patterns until they formed habits of correct language use. According to this view, the quality and quantity of the language the child hears, as well as the consistency of the reinforcement offered by others in the environment, would shape the child's language behavior. This theory gives great importance to the environment as the source of everything the child needs to learn. Lightbound and Spada 2006. Levin 1984, as cited in Michel and Miles 2004, points out that even in cultures where child-directed speech of the Western type is rare or absent, children are constantly in group settings and surrounded by contextualized talk routines. In such settings, their early utterances frequently include partial imitations and the production of on analyzed and rote-learned segments, picked up in routinized situations. Levin, 1994, page 62, as cited in Michel and Miles, 2004. And second language acquisition. Like first language learners, second language learners produce many sentences that they could not have heard, as a matter of fact, before. For some advanced learners who are determined to improve their pronunciation, careful listening and imitation in a language laboratory can be very effective. But for beginning learners, the slavish imitation and rote memorization that characterized audiolingual language approaches to language teaching can lead to a dead end. Lightbound and Spado, 2006. They further add, learners need to do more than recite bits of perfectly accurate language. They learn as they make the effort needed to understand and make themselves understood in genuinely meaningful interaction. Otherwise, they may have acquired little more than a collection of sentences, waiting for their moment when those sentences will be useful. Page 184. In relation to the legitimate use of imitation, Brown, 2007, argues that a very limited portion of classroom speaking time may legitimately be spent generating human tape recorder speech, where, for example, learners practice an intonation contour or try to pinpoint a certain vowel sound. Imitation of this kind is carried out not for the purpose of meaningful interaction, but for focusing on some particular elements of language form. Drilling. In response to drilling, the crucial question is whether it is a legitimate part of the communicative language classroom. According to Brown, 2007, the answer is a qualified yes. He defines drills as drills offer students an opportunity to listen and to orally repeat certain strings of language that may pose some linguistic difficulty, either phonological or grammatical. Drills are to language teaching what the pitching machine is to baseball. They offer limited practice through repetition. They allow one to focus on one element of language in a controlled activity. They can help to establish certain psychomotor patterns and to associate selected grammatical forms with their appropriate context. Here are some useful guidelines for successful drills. Keep them short, a few minutes of a class hour only. Keep them simple, preferably just one point at a time. Keep them snappy. Make sure students know why they are doing the drill. Limit them to phonology or grammar points. Make sure they ultimately lead to communicative goals. And don't overuse them. Okay, Kenworthy, 1987, as cited in Jones, 1997, believes that the benefits of imitation drills may depend on learners' aptitude for oral mimicry. For learners without good ears, drills may cause production to stabilize before reading the target. To be truly effective, drills have to move beyond the simple identification and mimicking of decontextualized sound contrasts to the perception of more meaningful communicative characteristics of input. Wang, 1987, page 180, as cited in Jones, 1997. Formulaic speech. The clearest evidence for the role of imitation is provided by set phrases, for example, or i.e. formulaic speech, that learners often produce as a means of copying with common or important situations in their environment. Davies and Elder, 2006. It is believed that phrases results from imitation comes from the fact that the learner's other output shows no evidence that he or she has mastered the grammar that underlies them. As a matter of fact, a learner may regularly use phrases at an early stage of learning, although they don't have enough grammar knowledge to produce them. Formulaic speech is an important feature of sound language use and learning. Ray, 2000. On the one hand, like simplification, it gives speakers the linguistic tools for copying with situations that would otherwise be beyond their competence. On the other hand, it may provide them with a memorized store of language samples which they can possess internally, so that the underlying rules gradually become incorporated into their developing linguistic competence. Habit formation. According to Jones, 1997, part of the reason for the focus on habit formation in acquiring L2 phonology is the special characteristics of pronunciation, which, unlike other language skills, involves both cognitive and motor functions. Gass, 1997, maintains, in behaviorist views of language learning, input was central to an understanding of how learners acquire the language. First or second, imitation and habit formation were primary concepts in this process. If habits were formed through imitation, then it was necessary to examine the input to learners to determine what they were imitation. It was necessary to examine the relationship between the input, what was to be imitated, and production, the product of imitation. Page 171. Elicited imitation tests. One device that has been widely used in SLA is elicited imitation. According to Barquizon and Ellis, 2005, learners listen to a set of sentences one at a time. The sentences having been constructed to contain examples of the target feature. After each sentence, they try to imitate it. The idea underlying this procedure is that if the sentences are long enough, the learners will not be able to memorize the exact words in the sentence, but will have to process it for meaning, and thus, when called upon to imitate it, will need to re-encode the meaning using their own linguistic resources. Claims have been made that elicited imitation tests, traditionally designed to test learners' knowledge of precise grammatical factors, for example, Gallimore and Thor, 1981, Hamayoun, etc., 1977, and Monique and others, 1994, as cited in LELB, 2006, provide accurate representations of a learner's interlanguage system. The claim is that in order for the learner to be able to correctly imitate the target language structure, it must be part of the learner's interlanguage system. In this response, LELB 2006 maintains, in order to examine the question of whether elicited imitation tests are reconstructive or whether they allow for rote imitation, it is important to consider evidence from recent research in cognitive psychology on working memory, page 467. Ellis 2005, as cited in Barquizan and Ellis 2005, describes an elicited imitation test that incorporated a dual purpose: to distract learners from attempting to memorize the sentences prior to production. The sentences to be imitated consisted of belief statements to which learners were asked to respond by agreeing or disagreeing before they attempted to imitate them. Working memory has replaced the traditional behavioristic understanding of memory, which proposed that short-term retention was a function of short-term memory capacity and it was uninfluenced by learners' long-term knowledge of language. Special 2004, as cited in Erland 2006. Recent experimental studies have shown that the more non-word-like non-words are, the greater the difficulty participants will experience in repeating sequences of such words. Gathur, Cole, and Baddeley 1993, as cited in Erland 2006. It is claimed that this is because participants have not had any prior experience with the material they are being asked to recall, and so have not had the opportunity to build up long-term memory representation. Ellis 2001, as cited in Erland 2006, adds, "This is why elicited imitation tests serve so well as measures of second language competence." Page 48. Results from such research suggest that the capacity of working memory is determined by the stored knowledge that already exists about the language. Baddeley and others, 1998, as cited in LM 2006. According to Gass and Selinker 2008, a common way to collect data is elicited imitation, which allows a precise experimental design, usually including similar structures that vary along only one linguistic dimension. Thus, this technique can be used to target a specific linguistic area. As the term implies, this is a technique whereby a subject hears a sentence, often tape recorded, and then is asked to repeat it exactly. If the sentence is long enough, the subject will not be able to remember the sound and repeat it, and it is therefore stored as a semantic or meaningfully related unit, and the learner has to recreate the sentence using his or her knowledge of the second language. This then gives the researcher an indication of the structure of the learner's grammar. During the 1950s and 60s, there were challenges to the behaviorist theory of language and language learning. Language came to be seen not as a set of automatic habits, but as a set of structured rules. These rules were claimed to be learned not by imitation, but by actively formulating them on the basis of innate principles or universal grammar, as well as on the basis of exposure to the language being learned. Gassenseninger, 2008. Criticism regarding the role of imitation in language learning. Behavioristic theories of language learning were seriously challenged by Chomsky 1959, as cited in Hadley 2003, in a very critical review of Skinner's work. Chomsky maintained that language behavior was far more complex than the establishment of SR or stimulus response connections. It was shown that imitation and reinforcement have a much smaller role to play in child language than Skinner and his colleagues imagined. In this response, Ellis 1997 argues behaviorism cannot adequately account for L2 acquisition. Learners frequently do not produce output that simply reproduces the input. Furthermore, the systematic nature of their errors demonstrate that they are actively involved in constructing their own rules that sometimes bear little resemblance to the pattern of language modeled in the input. In short, learning is not just a response to external stimuli. Page 32. According to Lightbound and Spada 2006, it is difficult to find support for the argument that languages are learned mainly through imitation. Learners produce many novel sentences and utterances that they could not have heard before. These sentences are based on their developing understanding of how the language system works. According to Cook and Newson, 1996, in all Chomskyan models, a characteristic of competence is its creative aspect. The speaker's knowledge of language must be able to cope with sentences that it has never heard or produced before. E-language depends on history, pieces of language that happen to have been said in the past. E-language, external language, internal language. Competence must deal with the speaker's ability to utter or comprehend sentences that have never been said before. Page 63. As Lightbound and Spado 2006 have said, in the case of second language learners who say, the cowboy rided into town, which is wrong grammatically, and the man that I spoke to him is angry, which is also incorrect, we notice some novel utterances that are not grammatical. These examples and many others provide evidence that language learners do not simply internalize a great list of imitated and memorized sentences. According to James 2001, this phenomenon is referred to as overgeneralization, when the error is the result of trying to use a rule in a context where it does not belong. For example, a regular ed ending on an irregular verb, as in bide instead of bought. This does not mean, however, that imitation has no role to play in language learning, according to Lightbound and Spada. Instead, language learners selectively imitate certain words or structures that they are in the process of learning. Thus, imitation may be an individual learning strategy, but it is not a universal characteristic of language learners. Lightbound and Spada. Page 183. While it is recognized that the environment plays a role in language acquisition, what precisely is meant by the environment and how it influences development remains unclear. Lantolf, 2006. On the one hand, they seem to posit an autonomous learner equipped with mechanisms such as intention, detention, imitation, sequential abilities, analogy, who then operates on the affordances available in a relatively inert environment. According to Lantolf 2006, emergence in language acquisition takes place at the level of individual learners as a result of the interactions between innate abilities in learners and their experiences in the environment. Page 722. A position that seems to be more in line with a classic Piagetian rather than a Vygotskyan psychology. In the 1960s, the behaviorist theory of language and language learning was challenged. Language came to be seen in terms of structured rules instead of habits. Learning was seen not as imitation but as active rule formation. Guess and Selinger, 2008. Second language errors are not a reflection of faulty imitation, rather they are to be viewed as indications of a learner's attempt to figure out some system, that is, to impose regularity on the language the learner is exposed to. There has been some discussion in the literature, for example, McDale and others, 1982, as cited in LELB 2006, suggesting that elicited imitation may not be reconstructive in nature and that it may allow for the simple rote imitation of stimuli presented. Conclusion. Perhaps the oldest method of teaching pronunciation involves exercises in elocution, that is, imitation drills and reading aloud. Although now widely discredited in the areas of grammar and vocabulary teaching, the listen and repeat approach has persisted in the teaching of pronunciation. Jones, 1997. According to Pennington, 1996, as cited in Jones, 1997, it appears that although both imitation and discrimination drills have an important place in the teaching of pronunciation as a means to help articulation become more automatic and routinized, they are best seen as a step towards more meaningful communicative practice. In terms of learning purpose and language use as two crucial keys to social relevance of an L2 program, Cook, 1992, as cited in Kumaravadivelo, 2006, argues, in this context, learners are seldom exposed to the full range of their L2 in all its complexity that one would expect in a context where it is used as the primary vehicle of communication. In the use of an L2, the learner is not becoming an imitation native speaker, but a person who can stand between the two languages, using both when appropriate. We come to the references section, and as you can see, I have used how many sources? I think 19 sources. That's right, 19 sources. And if you want to study this article, just go to the description area and click on the link below, and also you can just cite this article according to this citation. And yeah, as you can see, I'm the author of this article, and also I've published so far at the LELB Society over 3,900 posts. Thank you so much for your attention, and hope to see you soon in our next video. Take care, and bye-bye everybody.